Good evening, all. I hope you're all doing well. In this video, I will give you a very brief overview on 17th century philosophy, and please pay a lot of attention to what you are going to hear in this video because it is going to be very helpful when we start dealing with our four philosophers. This video is going to pave the way for your understanding of what was really happening during 17th century Europe. To start with, the 17th century was the period when the intellectual roots of Western modernity were laid down. It was a time of intense religious, political, social, and intellectual controversy. Political, social, and philosophical thoughts of various kinds emerged and spread. The 17th century can be said to be the herald of European modernity in thought. I think I told you during the session here that the 17th century being in the middle between the Renaissance and the 18th century, the age of reason or the age of the Enlightenment, was extremely important. There were three main trends encompassing the intellectual life of 17th century Europe. The first one is skepticism. We talked about it before. Second one is rationalism, and the third one is empiricism. Now, let me explain each term on its own, and please, you need to take notes of what each term refers to. Before we explain the meaning of each of these terms in detail, let me first of all give you a very quick introduction on the intellectual background of the 17th century. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of modern science provided the intellectual background for the emergence of a vigorous and widespread intellectual culture in 17th century Europe. We talked about the Renaissance, we talked about the Reformation. You remember King Henry VIII cutting ties with the Roman Catholic Church and founding the Church of England or the Anglican Church. I told you this is very important. Now, all of these ideas, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and also the rise of modern science, were very important in the emergence of the intellectual culture in 17th century Europe. Whereas the earlier intellectual movements remained largely confined to the intellectual elites or religious sects, the 17th century witnessed the participation of relatively larger section of the European population in secular intellectual activities. So not only the elite who were involved in these intellectual activities, but actually most of the sects of the society at the time. Let me talk about the Renaissance. Now, what was the Renaissance? It was an intellectual movement which began in Italy in the 14th century, and from there it spread to almost all regions of Europe. It continued in various forms for over 2 centuries, leading to enormous changes in the intellectual culture of Europe. In contrast to the medieval European thought, which had considered God the center of the universe, Renaissance thinkers put man in the center of the world. Therefore, this philosophical shift became known as humanism because of the focus on the human and not God anymore. This was the most important philosophical contribution of the Renaissance to human thought. You know, the idea of humanism and that man was in the center of the universe. He's the center of the world and not God anymore. Another important development, though in religious sphere, was the Reformation, which reoriented the religious thinking and culture as established by the Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther, I think I referred to him during my sessions, he radically questioned the thought and practices of the Catholic Church, and he criticized it for not adhering to the original Christian doctrines. Martin Luther, Martin Bucer, John Calvin, again I talked about him, John Fox, and other leaders, established what became known as Protestantism. These scholars associated with the Catholic Church responded to the intellectual and religious challenges posed by Protestantism, and therefore the religious strife between Catholicism and Protestantism started to take shape. This clash between the two main Christian sects produced a lot of intellectual ferment, which ultimately influenced even non-religious thought in Egypt, in Europe, I'm sorry. That is why during last session, when we talked about the 16th century, I had to refer to the Reformation and what Henry VIII did by establishing the Church of England, because this had a huge impact on the philosophical and the intellectual sphere of 17th century Europe. What about the rise of modern science? Well, modern science began with a quiet reformulation of cosmology. Anybody remembers cosmology from our first session when we introduced philosophy, the study of the universe? In 1543, Copernicus published his book on the movement of the stars. His idea of the Earth orbiting around the Sun overturned the entire traditional wisdom about the relationship between the Earth and the rest of the solar system. Kepler, Galileo, and Newton were some of the towering figures within the movement, also known as the scientific revolution. Their ideas about the universe completely unsettled the received wisdom for a very long time in the West. The rise of modern science slowly spread the idea that it was the sun and not the earth which was the center of our solar system, and the universe, of which the solar system was part, was infinite in space. Then laws of motion were discovered, which conveyed the idea that movement of the objects in the universe, including that of humans, was not due to divine will or intervention. Rather, such movements had their own laws, which were common to all. The role of divine principles of God in the working of the universe was replaced by the ideas of cause and effect, which were physical in nature. These laws could be understood by observation and analysis rather than by divine relation. So when we talk about observation and analysis, we're definitely here talking about empiricism and rationalism. Thus, the new range of scientific discoveries brought out a huge universe with innumerable patterns which raised severe doubts on traditional Christian worldview, which no longer appeared to tally either with the newly discovered facts or with the logical reasoning. So that is why during the century here, people started doubting everything they learned about before, with reference to the Greeks, with reference even to medieval philosophy, which focused entirely on the importance of God and the divine and how this universe is moving forward. And that is why, the first trend that we will discuss will be skepticism, when people start doubting everything. So truth was no longer conceived as finite or narrow. All these developments had a lot of impact on the intellectual culture of modern Europe. Let me start by talking about skepticism. I think I talked about skepticism before as one branch of epistemology, if you remember, when you just doubt anything, doubt the existence of truth or the existence of knowledge in itself. And it was the 17th century that actually initiated this specific trend, because people started thinking about, different things in different spheres. And the first thing they started doubting was the traditionally received wisdom. So questions were raised not only towards the broadly religious Christian medieval period, but also towards the Renaissance glorification of the ancients, because some of the Renaissance scholars were highly interested in ancient philosophers like Aristotle, for instance. And during the 17th century, philosophers started doubting not only religion, but they started also doubting the ancient Greeks. The second theme acquired greater poignancy during the late 16th century, with many intellectuals raising doubts about the continuing validity of teachings received from the ancient Greeks and Romans. Jean Bodin and Michel de Montaigne were two important intellectuals who radically questioned the primacy of the ancients. In general sense, skepticism means doubt or belief which is manifested in our daily interaction. However, as a system of thought, it connotes a systematic expression of uncertainty, of suspicion, and disbelief towards any organized understanding of the world. Skepticism is generally understood as an attitude which is opposed to dogmatism, which follows a certain creed with a claim to fully know and explain the reality. So, skepticism, there is no creed, there is no system that you can follow to understand the world around you or even to understand yourself. Elements of skepticism can be found in all philosophical systems, as they doubt the validity of the preceding or rival philosophies. So you start by being skeptic about everything that took place before so that you can actually start anew. Or even if there is a competing, philosophy, a rival philosophy, you actually start by being a skeptic about it, by doubting its validity. But at a larger and far reaching level, skepticism raises doubts over everything and believes that no final version of reality and truth can be available in any matter. Historically, skepticism may be said to have originated in ancient Greek philosophy. Socrates and later Pyrrho of Elis, if you remember this, we talked about them when we dealt with ancient philosophy. They have been considered as the founders of two different versions of skepticism, academic skepticism and Pyrrhonism. But I don't really, I'm not interested in giving you the differences between these two versions of skepticism. Modern skepticism originated in the 16th century. It came into being due to big economic and cultural changes. The coming into prominence of ancient Greek texts in the course of the Renaissance and the exploration of the world by the Europeans, resulting in the gathering of various forms of knowledge, led to serious questioning of European medieval ideologies about the universe and about the society. The modern science and modern philosophy could emerge only through the process of skepticism towards all forms of received knowledge. Even further, some of them questioned the possibility of any certain form of knowledge whatsoever, which is really, strange when you just, question the possibility. You're not even questioning this knowledge, but you're questioning the possibility that you can be certain of any kind of knowledge whatsoever in your life. By the early 17th century, Christian skepticism had acquired a respectable position, particularly among the Catholic theologians. In general, skepticism had become so widespread in France that it began to invite fierce attacks from those who believed that it was undermining faith and from those who viewed it as dangerous for knowledge. During this period, skepticism usefully served to profess a variety of political positions from radicalism to conservatism. Montaigne and Hobbes both made use of skepticism for contrary arguments. I'll be talking about Hobbes, he's one of the four philosophers we will be discussing this course. Montaigne's writings were at times quite subversive to rulers. Hobbes argued that since it was difficult to arrive at the truth, it was impossible to agree to a common action by people, and therefore the ruler should be given powers to define and decide about the truth and punish those who deviate from his version of the truth. Again, I'm going to talk in detail about Hobbes. Descartes actually started his philosophy by being a complete or a total skeptic, denying all received knowledge, either through tradition or sense experiences. When we deal with Rene Descartes, you will understand that this was his first step. In his rationalist philosophy, that the first thing he has to do is to be skeptic about everything, to doubt the existence of anything, or to doubt the existence that anything that he perceives, whether through knowledge, either through tradition or through sense experiences, is actually true or valid. The only trustworthy entity was the thinking mind, which was capable of producing confirmed knowledge through a deductive process. We'll talk more about Rene Descartes. Again, he's one of the four philosophers we'll be discussing this course. Skepticism made significant inroads in the field of religion as well. Spinoza, one of my philosophers that we'll be discussing, and Richard Simon raised questions about the Bible. Can you imagine? The religious people, in their turn, accused the skeptics of atheism, libertinism, and immorality. So if you are going to raise doubts about the validity of Christianity, then definitely you're going to be seen by religious people as being an atheist and being an immoral human being. However, skepticism was quite frequently used by religious leaders and writers to discredit their opponents. Thus, Christians raised doubts about pagan creeds, the Protestants about Catholics, and vice versa. And even within Protestantism itself, the Lutherans, people who follow Martin Luther, question the Calvinists, people who follow John Calvin, and so on. So even inside the religious institution itself, right? They started being skeptic about things that came before them, about pagan creeds, and even the different people belonging to the different religious sects, Protestants being skeptic about Catholics, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So actually, skepticism was one of the major trends during the 17th century. The skeptics pointed out the weak foundation of the knowledge of their rival sects. In fact, during the late 16th and 17th centuries, the radical questioning of rival sects in the Christian world was quite common. Skepticism towards rival religions as well and sects suited the religious persons quite well, and Blaise Pascal in France went so far as to Christianize skepticism by arguing that it might strongly support Christianity if it was properly understood. So even people started to doubt the validity of other religions during the 17th century. The next major trend during the 17th century was rationalism. And rationalism is generally considered the mode of thinking which emphasizes that pure reason can function as a source of our knowledge without being restricted by our concrete experiences. So simply, being a rationalist, it means here that you need to have pure reason as your only source of knowledge, right? And you should not be distracted more or less or restricted by your concrete experiences, because concrete experiences here refers of course to empiricism, which we'll explain later. So being a rationalist here means that your focus has to be on pure reason. Rationalism conceives of the human cognitive faculties as distinguished into the pure intellect, the senses, and the imagination. The pure intellect was the faculty that enabled human beings to gain knowledge. So only through pure intellect, through the senses, and through imagination that a person can have knowledge. Rationalism may also be defined as the view that substantive truth about the nature of reality may be derived from the pure intellect alone, operating independently of the imagination and the senses. Well, yes, here it could also be referred to the idea that you understand truth, you understand the world around you only through pure reason. You might not be able to use your senses or use your imagination, but you're going to focus entirely on how your pure reason can give you an insight into understanding yourself and understanding the world around you. Rationalism explicitly or implicitly maintained that it was possible to comprehend the nature of truth and reality by means of a priori reasoning. This reasoning was independent of the sense experiences. Do you remember a priori? A priori reasoning. We talked about this, right? A priori and empiricism, right? So a priori refers to rationalism, i.e., things that you already know, things that you can use your pure reason to understand, which is in complete contrast to empiricism. The Greek philosopher Plato is regarded as the originator of rationalism. Later, the Christian philosopher St. Augustine synthesized Plato with Christian thinking. Rationalism emerged as one of the most powerful currents of thought during the 17th century. And it was René Descartes, a French philosopher, who formulated the main ideas of rationalism in modern times. Although rationalism existed since long back and continued later, the period of the rationalism in philosophy is generally considered to be from 1637, the year of publication of Descartes' Discourse on Method, to 1716 when Leibniz died. Okay, so mainly we're talking about the time between 1637 and 1716. This was the time when René Descartes formulated the main ideas of rationalism in modern times. Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632, dying in 1677, is a Dutch philosopher and a follower of Descartes. And he developed a system of philosophy which can be said to be the purest example of rationalism. So when we deal with rationalism, we will be focusing on two major philosophers, René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. While his contemporary and preceding rationalists kept believing in God and religion, Spinoza was accused of being an atheist who thought that it wasn't God but human beings whose actions were relevant for the society. Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz was a German philosopher and mathematician. According to him, the universe possessed a rational order which was possible to grasp by human minds. In other words, the whole of the universe was intelligible to human intellect. The rationalist tradition from Descartes to Leibniz suggested explicitly or implicitly that although God existed, humanity could function without God. How? Why? Because of the intellect, because of pure reason, because of your mind. As simple as that, right? Now, all the examples, Leibniz and Spinoza and Descartes are rationalist philosophers. However, we'll be focusing later on Spinoza and Descartes. The third trend in 17th century philosophy is empiricism, and it is the opposite of rationalism. The speculative nature of the rationalist philosophies of Descartes and his successors received sharp challenge from the empiricist and experimental philosophy, particularly concentrated in 17th century England. In Europe, there had been a traditional separation between rationalism and empiricism. While rationalism flourished mostly in France, empiricism took roots largely in Britain. Empiricism, in its basic form, claims that all knowledge about the world is derived from sense perceptions. In other words, our experiences of our surroundings through the five sense organs form the basis for all forms of knowledge. So it's not your reason, it's not your intellect, but it's your experiences of your surroundings by the five senses. Experiences from the boundaries beyond which our knowledge cannot reach. Experience alone is the originator and justification of all knowledge in the world. Knowledge derived from custom, tradition, revelation, and metaphysical speculations cannot form the basis of true knowledge. So the basis of true knowledge comes via our experiences through our five sense organs. The empiricists reject the knowledge which is not derived from human sense experience and which is not verifiable. In Western philosophy, the Greek sophists are considered the earliest empiricists. Aristotle is also considered to be the founder of empiricism at a higher philosophical level. In medieval Europe, Thomas Aquinas is regarded as an empiricist because he believed in the primacy of the senses as the source of knowledge, and who stated that there is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. So according to Thomas Aquinas, right, your knowledge first of all comes through the senses and then it actually goes to your mind, not the other way around. Francis Bacon the first philosopher we'll be dealing with when I see you next week, is considered to be a precursor of empiricism in modern times. However, we also have John Locke, we have George Berkeley, and we have David Hume in Britain, who are generally regarded as the most important empiricist philosophers. However, in our course, we will only be focusing on Francis Bacon. During the 17th century, we also had a lot of political theories. I already talked to you during our session about 17th century political history. And of course, you can assume that it was difficult. It was so complicated, full of challenges and full of problems. And that is why during the 17th century, we had some political theoreticians dealing with what was happening in the country and trying to put their own theories, of understanding what was happening then. So there were several philosophers all over Europe who propounded political theories. One of the major political theoreticians was Thomas Hobbes. We'll be dealing with Hobbes, who became famous with the publication of De Cive, or On the Citizen, Elements of Law, and Leviathan. He is considered as a committed political realist. We will be dealing with Thomas Hobbes after we finish Bacon, Descartes, and Spinoza, as an example of a political theoretician writing during the 17th century. Now, please listen to this many times. Try to understand the major trends that were famous during the 17th century, because if you understand them, you will definitely have no problem in understanding the philosophers, right? Next session, we'll deal with Francis Bacon's philosophy. I'm going to send you a handout. Please read it before I meet you next week. Thank you so much, and see you soon.